I want to welcome you today to this 50-30 Challenge panel. We're very excited that we've been able to get the agreement of our wonderful guest speakers to all have one time that they could join us today. And today's going to be a bit of like a fireside chat. I don't know what you're looking at when you look out your window, but it's looking very cold and snowy and frosty out there for me. So I want us to think about a crackling fire and a candid conversation among three people who bring a lot of expertise to the conversation we're going to have today. My name is Kim Vance-Mubanga, and I'm the Director of Programs and Partnerships here at Egale Canada. I use she, her pronouns. And just to take you a little bit of an overview for the next 90 minutes, we're going to have 3 rounds of questions with our panelists. After the first 2 rounds, each of the panelists will have an opportunity to ask questions or make comments about each other's comments. And then after the 3rd round of questions, we will open it up to you as the participants to ask questions of our guests. Hopefully, if we're running on time, we'll have a good chunk of time for those questions and answers at the end. Just a few housekeeping notes. This is a bilingual panel, so we will have speakers in French and English. The way that you can select, we do have interpretation for this event. If you look on your screens, you will have, along the bottom panel, you will have 3 dots in a circle. If you click on that, you will be able to check off which language you would like your interpretation in. And if you don't want to hear the original speaker while you're getting that interpretation, you should mute the original audio. Just a bit of a background quickly. I think most of you are familiar, but the 50-30 Challenge is an initiative between the Government of Canada, Canadian businesses, and diversity organizations. And the program's goal is to challenge Canadian organizations to increase representation and inclusion of diverse groups within their workplaces, while highlighting the benefits of giving all Canadians a seat at the table. This panel, like I said, will be happening in English and French. And Egale Canada, who are the hosts of the panel today, are located on the treaty lands and the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee people. This territory is protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, the meeting place of Toronto, also known as Takaranto, is home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to work and live on this land. Before I begin with questions, I will just introduce the panelists very briefly. This one isn't their full bio. I encourage you to go to the landing page to sort of fully appreciate the experience that our panelists are bringing to you today. Our first panelist is Lee Badgett, who is a pioneering researcher of the global cost of homophobia and transphobia, economic empowerment of LGBTI plus people, and LGBTI plus economic inequality. She's the chief economist and co-founder of COPPA, the LGBTI Economic Power Lab. In addition, Badgett is the professor emeritus of economics and former director of the School of Public Policy at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She is a Williams Distinguished Scholar at UCLA's Williams Institute, where she was a co-founder of the first research director. She has worked with many institutions such as the World Bank, Open for Business, UNDP, USAID, IDB, ADB, and the US State Department, as well as many LGBTI plus organizations. Next is Mitzi Hunter. Mitzi is a dynamic, community-grounded leader and president and CEO of the Canadian Women's Foundation, a 50-30 Challenge participant. Her 30 years of leadership spans the nonprofit sector, private sector, and government. Mitzi has a trailblazing track record and many successes championing infrastructure and community improvements. She was the first Black woman to serve as Ontario's Minister of Education. She also served as Ontario's Minister of Advanced Education and Skills Development and Associate Minister of Finance. She is known for her expertise in an array of issues, from women's leadership to inclusive economies to sustainable neighborhood and city building. She is currently a senior fellow with the C.D. Howe Institute and Canadian urban leader at the University of Toronto's School of Cities. And finally, we have Fabrice Houdard, who's a human rights and corporate social responsibility specialist with 20 years of experience at the World Bank and the United Nations. In 2020, he founded the Association of LGBTQ plus corporate directors. And in 2023, he co-founded COPPA, a nonprofit focused on LGBTQ plus economic empowerment. At the UN, in the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, he worked on the Free and Equal campaign, a campaign for LGBTQ plus inclusion. He co-authored the UN Corporate Standards of Conduct for Business, the largest LGBTI corporate social responsibility initiative supported by over 500 companies. And he volunteers on the boards of nonprofit organizations, including Outright International, Housing Works, the Institute of Current World Affairs, CUNY TV Foundation, and the LGBTQ plus Corporate Directors of Canada Association. So welcome to our esteemed guests. And we're just going to move right into our Q&A section so that we can stay on time today. And we're going to start with you, Lee. Based on your experience, could you highlight some key findings from the research that you've done on economic impacts of exclusion?
Yes, thank you so much. I'd be very happy to talk about that. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today. Economists have been looking at this issue for a very long time, along the lines of many different groups who have faced forms of exclusion, whether that is people of color in the United States, women, cisgender women in particular, and I'll talk some about LGBTI people. But let me just give you a sense of how important inclusion is in the economy today. Again, this research is mostly based in the US, but I think it applies pretty generally. A recent study took the rapid growth of the American economy from 1960 up to 2010, I believe, and said, how much of that could be explained by the fact that early in that time period, we enacted laws that said it's illegal to discriminate in employment and lots of other kinds of settings, educational settings, against women and against people of color. And what they found was, of that entire economic growth, somewhere between 20 and 40% of it was due specifically to the fact that we engaged those laws, our norms and our practices changed around discrimination, reducing barriers for women and people of color to acquire education, which is a really important part of what economists think of as quote unquote human capital, the stuff, the skills, the knowledge that we gather that has an important role in economic growth. So that's, I think a gateway to thinking about just how important inclusion is. It's also extremely important in looking at the status of LGBTQI people. So sorry, I'm going to say it the American way. It's a smaller group of people than all women, cisgender women, and all people of color put together. And yet, we have been finding consistently in country after country where we have done studies that inclusion provides economic benefits for economies. So let's talk about that for a second. Let me just break it down a little bit. It really mostly is tied to this idea of human capital and what people learn when they go to school. It's how healthy they are in terms of their ability, both mental and physical health, to participate in the economy. And it's a lot about how they're treated once they get into the workplace. Are they treated fairly or not? So we know what exclusion looks like. It looks like discrimination. It looks like bullying in schools. It looks like discrimination by healthcare providers. It looks like the pressure that gets put on people who face some form of marginalization, like LGBTQI people. It looks like the impact of that kind of treatment on their health. on their mental health, on their physical health. And I will say there are studies after studies, they're still coming out showing the kinds of disparities that result from that kind of psychological pressure. So we see higher rates of anxiety and depression, higher rates of suicide attempts and thinking about suicide. We see higher rates of violence against LGBTI people, higher rates of HIV, higher rates of substance use and alcohol use. And these have been tied not to some characteristic of LGBTI people, but to the treatment that they are exposed to in the world. So that kind of minority stress, as folks in the public health world call it, play an important role in holding back the participation of LGBTI people. Similarly, bullying in education means that people are going to have a harder time staying in school and continuing on in school to get the education that they're capable of. When you get to the workplace, harassment, other kinds of discriminatory treatment, like just treating people differently because they are LGBTI or not. That also means that employers are not thinking about putting the best person in the job and getting them to their highest level of productivity, but it's actually, again, holding people back. We have various ways of estimating what those effects are, given the kinds of data sources that we have available. And as I said, in country after country, there's probably 15 countries, 15 to 20 countries now that have had these sorts of studies done. And we consistently find somewhere on the order of 1% of GDP is lost as a result of the pulling out of LGBT people's ability to contribute to the economy. You could think about that as a kind of recession, as a kind of structural recession. We're holding ourselves back, our economy's back. You could say, well, that's the size of the economy in Turkey or the Netherlands. We're just like we are missing an entire set of uh, of people being able to participate fully. And it hurts not just those people. Bullying and discrimination do hurt LGBTI people, but the economic effects actually hurt us all. So that's kind of, I would say, the overview and some of the key findings that we've seen.
Thanks for that, Lee. That's very, very helpful to be able to sort of situate it as sort of the GDP of an entire country and to sort of view it in that way. Maintenant, j'aimerais poser une question en français à Fabrice. Fabrice, quelles sont les recommandations que les organisations peuvent prendre immédiatement pour réduire l'impact de l'exclusion?
D'abord, merci de m'avoir ici, Kim. Parce que je suis basé à New York, j'ai eu l'opportunité d'écrire un petit peu sur la retraite des entreprises privées aux États-Unis sur la question LGBT ces derniers temps. Et une des choses sur laquelle j'ai beaucoup écrit, c'est cette idée de connaître son étoile polaire. Je ne sais pas si c'est la bonne traduction, mais en anglais, on dit Know Your North Star. Et c'est cette idée que probablement la chose la plus importante pour une entreprise, c'est de comprendre qu'elle a des responsabilités. Qu'elle a des responsabilités en termes sur l'environnement, par exemple, mais elle a aussi des responsabilités sur la question des droits de l'homme. Et prévenir la discrimination contre les personnes LGBT, ça fait partie des responsabilités des entreprises sur la question des droits de l'homme. Et je pense que c'est très important de le dire, même si jamais on est là pour parler du coût économique de la discrimination, c'est de toujours rappeler que les entreprises ont des responsabilités sur la question des droits de l'homme. Ça ne viendrait pas à l'esprit d'aucune entreprise de dire, par exemple, qu'elle n'a pas de responsabilité par rapport au travail des enfants, ou qu'elle n'a pas de responsabilité par rapport au trafic humain. De la même manière, elle a des responsabilités de protéger ses employés contre la discrimination au travail, bien sûr, et comme Lee l'a mentionné, contre le harassement aussi. Et donc, je dirais que cette idée pour une entreprise de connaître ses responsabilités par rapport à ses employés LGBT, c'est extrêmement important. Et on le voit un petit peu dans le débat aux États-Unis aujourd'hui, qu'il y a beaucoup d'entreprises qui reculent parce qu'elles n'avaient jamais vraiment compris que ça n'était pas de la charité, que ça n'était pas de la philanthropie, mais que c'était une manière d'aligner ces procédures et ces politiques avec les droits de l'homme. Euh, Peut-être une recommandation un petit peu plus concrète, c'est de toujours commencer par convaincre la direction de l'entreprise. Pour moi, dans mon expérience, en ayant travaillé avec quelques entreprises, parfois des grosses entreprises, c'est que la différence la plus majeure entre une entreprise qui réussit sur le thème de l'inclusion des personnes LGBT et une entreprise qui ne réussit pas, c'est est-ce que le CEO et le conseil exécutif et le conseil d'administration ont compris que c'était à la fois une bonne chose de manière économique et une bonne chose de manière éthique et une bonne chose aussi pour le développement de l'entreprise dans le long terme de supporter ses employés LGBT. Et aujourd'hui, ce qu'on voit souvent avec un peu la débâcle qui est en train d'arriver dans le secteur privé aux États-Unis sur cette question, c'est que souvent, les dirigeants n'avaient pas compris pourquoi c'est quelque chose d'essentiel pour l'entreprise. Je dirais qu'une autre recommandation, et je pense que Lee sera d'accord avec moi parce qu'elle aime beaucoup les données, d'avoir une bonne connaissance des données. Alors, ce n'est pas toujours possible dans tous les contextes, mais moi, ce que j'ai trouvé, par exemple, quand j'ai travaillé à la Banque mondiale, c'est que le moment où la Banque mondiale a réalisé qu'à peu près 50% des employés étaient dans le placard, qu'il y avait 2 ou 3 ou 4% des employés qui reportaient avoir eu une expérience d'harassement sur la place de travail, la Banque mondiale a commencé à faire quelque chose. C'est-à-dire que le moment où vous arrivez à mettre des chiffres, à visualiser quelle est l'expérience de l'employé LGBT dans votre entreprise, les entreprises en général commencent à faire quelque chose. Donc, pour moi, c'est un peu les trois recommandations. C'est un, connaître votre étoile polaire, c'est-à-dire comprendre quelles sont vos responsabilités en tant qu'entreprise, puisque une entreprise ne vit pas dans un vacuum, elle vit dans la société, elle a un rôle à jouer. Deuxièmement, c'est se concentrer sur convaincre la direction et les conseils exécutifs et le board de l'importance de cet agenda. Et troisièmement, avoir des données, c'est-à-dire pouvoir mesurer quelle est l'amplitude du problème et aussi pouvoir mesurer les progrès qu'on fait. Donc, je dirais pour moi, ça, c'est trois éléments que n'importe quelle entreprise qui souhaite s'engager sur une meilleure inclusion des personnes LGBT avec lesquelles une entreprise peut commencer.
Merci, and thank you for the very concrete three things that can be done right away. So we're going to actually go to our Canadian panelists now, Mitzi, and we're going to talk a lot about the backlash that we're seeing, especially coming out of the US, but we're going to ask you as the Canadian to kind of talk about some of this backlash that we're seeing against DEI initiatives. And from a Canadian kind of lens, how do you think we can counteract that narrative by highlighting the ways that diversity drives economic growth? And what do you think are some of the myths about DEI that we're seeing that need to be unpacked a little bit, especially in the Canadian context?
Thank you, Kim, and thank you to Egale for creating this this beautiful space for us to have this very important and timely conversation. And I've been listening to my fellow panelists with keen interest, and you know, we're very similar here in Canada in terms of seeing the rapid economic impact when we are experiencing exclusion or inclusion, in fact. And so one of the things I want to recognize Canada for is that as part of our value set, we have enshrined minority rights and individual rights as part of our Constitution in the form of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And it's very critical that we remember that is enshrined in law, and that these rights are things that are guaranteed. But when it comes to practice and it comes to the workplace and it comes to the economy, we have to continue to fight for and to enforce those rights, and to talk about them, as particularly where they are not working. The work that I do at the Canadian Women's Foundation puts an intersectional gender lens across all of the work that we do. And, you know, just recently, a few months ago, actually, I was at a summit that we organized. It was in Montreal. And we brought together 75 feminist entrepreneurs, just a fabulous gathering. And, you know, these are businesses that have been created, women-led, those who identify. And what was striking to me as I looked around that room was that, you know, they represent every part of our community and our economy, and really deserve the right to have space, to take up space. And this approach is something that I think is important. When Lee was speaking about you know, the effects on the economy, this is something we tracked in Canada during the effects of the pandemic that was having on our economy, and we saw that there was a she-cession, that women in particular were affected in a specific way. And we needed policies that were designed to address that. Otherwise, we were losing some capacity there. At the same time, you know, when we look at our productivity, that's an issue that we face here in Canada. We lag the United States by about 30%. There's a big gap in terms of productivity, and that's really the economic health of our country. Yet if we were to open up more opportunities for a more gender equal Canada, we would see that there would be a material gain in productivity. And so, you know, when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we have to also recognize that it's not affecting or impacting people in the same way, that an intersectional lens is something that is really important, that it does matter. So, you know, when we look at our data and our information, if you apply that gendered lens, so even if, say, for instance, we reach that 50% of you know, equality on boards for women or 2S LGBTQIA plus individuals, or 30% in organizations. If you apply a gender lens, you often see there's an even wider gap when it comes to, say, Black women or Indigenous women, and peoples. And so it's really important that as we're applying these policies that we recognize that they're not affecting everyone in the same way, and that we have to also layer on top of that an intersectionality. And also one of the myths that I want to put on the table as well is we also have to be careful how we measure and what types of frames we are using. And sometimes these systems that have been in place and that we're sort of holding everyone to that standard have biases. They have privilege, they have economic status. Sometimes they're steeped in white supremacist histories or colonialism. And these are things that we need to be prepared to deconstruct, to look at, and to change, and to respond. And And so I think that's also an aspect that I wanted to make sure we table in this conversation, is that we're not all experiencing even exclusion in the same way. You know, there's a report that was put out by an organization in Canada. It's a pan-Canadian organization called the Prosperity Project. And every year they sort of measure what's happening in corporate Canada and who's advancing, how women are doing. And one of the things I was really careful to suggest was that we have to have intersectionality, because not all women are experiencing progress in the same way. And when we applied that intersectional lens, we recognize that, you know, while in certain areas women are gaining around 30%, advancing in C-suites and in corporate leadership, when you apply that lens, Black women and Indigenous women are less than 1%, and in some cases don't even show up. And so that gap still needs to be addressed. And it can only be done if we call it out and we measure it and we hold those responsible accountable.
Amazing. Thanks so much. So now we have a round of for you to comment or to ask questions of each other. So I know we're fresh into it, but anything pop into mind, Lee or Fabrice or Mitzi, on anything any of the others of you have said?
Yeah, I have a question. I think both of you, Fabrice and Mitzi, were talking about, you know, the importance of values as underlying these kinds of DEI efforts and thinking, or human rights, and I wondered about what some people call the business case for diversity, and especially for LGBTI inclusion. And so I didn't hear that come up, and I'm wondering if that's something that's got salience in the Canadian context, as it seems to, or it used to have in the US context, and what role does that argument play now at this point in history? The idea that businesses will gain, they'll be more profitable and more productive. And we do see some evidence of that in the LGBTI space.
Lee, if I could just start, absolutely. Maybe I should have gone into that as well in my comments, because there is definitely a business case for diversity. It's already well established. Research suggests that diverse leadership improves financial performance, innovation. It enhances team culture, and problem-solving capabilities of organizations. It's essentially, it makes them stronger and more resilient and connected to their markets. I also think that if we're looking at younger generations as they enter workforces and become consumers in their own rights, this generation is looking for diversity and inclusion in the workplace. And in fact, if they don't see it, they're going to vote, you know, by leaving the organizations where we know talent matters and talent has a real cost, and certainly in terms of customers as well. So I do think that there is certainly a business case. It's been well documented, and companies have to pay attention to that. Now, there's a shifting dynamic happening right now. Certainly we see that in the United States, and it's affecting U.S. multinationals. So we have to see this play out. My hope is that these strong values have been rooted and that they will, at the end of the day, prevail.
Je dirais particulièrement sur la question des consommateurs, ce qui est assez fascinant et qu'on observe en fait aux États-Unis, mais qu'on observe de manière assez globale, c'est que, par exemple, le secteur de la mode et de la beauté continue d'engager les personnes LGBT parce qu'ils souhaitent acquérir les consommateurs de la Gen V, donc de la plus jeune génération, et ils savent que cette génération, souvent, de plus en plus souvent, s'identifie comme étant LGBT ou est même alliée à la cause LGBT. Et par contre, on peut voir qu'il y a des industries qui ne voient pas tellement ce lien et qui abandonnent les consommateurs LGBT de manière beaucoup plus rapide. Et c'est vrai qu'en fait, ce qui est fascinant, c'est que au bout du compte, la démographie, on ne peut pas changer la démographie. C'est-à-dire que ce qu'on voit, c'est que de manière inéluctable, les générations les plus jeunes s'identifient comme étant LGBT et souhaitent se reconnaître dans la publicité, souhaitent se reconnaître même parmi les dirigeants des sociétés. Et donc on voit une grosse différence, par exemple, avec le secteur du manufacturing, où les entreprises lâchent en fait les personnes LGBT, et le secteur de la beauté, de la mode, du sport, qui continue à engager ces consommateurs. Et donc je pense que souvent le problème, c'est un manque d'informations sur qui sont les consommateurs du futur. Mais en effet, c'est aussi une partie importante du business case.
Thanks. Anything else before we move on? We're a bit behind time, so we can move on and then keep having these chats, make it up at the end. And I'm going to come back to you now, Fabrice, en anglais this time, just to talk a little bit about your heavy engagement with boards and governance structures. And sort of what do you see as some of the main challenges, in particular for LGBTI people, in accessing boards and governance structures within organizations?
You will notice that, my French has gotten worse, but my English has not improved. So now I really don't have a language anymore. But I'll tell you, I find that this is fascinating. The boardroom is an aspect of business that a lot of people don't really pay attention to. It's kind of opaque. The selection process is extremely subjective. And yet, it has become a topic of conversation because, of course, because it has power and influence. It's probably the least diversified section of business, right? It's so much easier to diversify rank and file employees than to diversify in places where there is, frankly, money and power. And as I mentioned, as you mentioned in my bio, I created a nonprofit which tried to improve representation of LGBT people in the boardroom in the US. It looks like it's going to be an uphill battle now. And I'm also on the board of a similar association that is trying to do the same thing in Canada, which is probably I'm more hopeful about. But I have identified 3 reasons why LGBT people are severely underrepresented in the boardroom. And we know that they're severely underrepresented. We have data. We know that they have only 0.9% of the board seats on Fortune 500 companies, as an example. And they have about 1.2% of board seats on NASDAQ, on that exchange. We know it because NASDAQ had required companies to disclose whether they had an LGBT board member or not. Now, in America, it looks like a stable 7.6% of the population at this point self-identify as LGBT. So that's a pretty big representation gap. And I love to talk about the network gap, right? Which is, if you are LGBT, you live a little bit at the margin of the ecosystem of power. And frankly, not only if you are LGBT, if you're a woman, if you're a person of color, you are less likely to be connected by people that are going to tap you on the shoulder and say, oh, you're amazing. I've been observing what you've been doing, and I would love for you to join my board. I love to caricature it and say, gay people don't really vacation in Martha's Vineyard or are on the board of the PGA, and that's kind of a caricature, but it's true. LGBT people are less likely to be in those places where people are being tapped to become a board member. I would say that the second aspect is the generational gap, right? We cannot forget the fact that until very recently, it was extremely risky to be out in business, right? In fact, I love to talk about an article in which Michele Burns, it was in the New York Times recently, Michele Burns said that she left the race to become CEO of Procter & Gamble because she felt that it would bring too much scrutiny to her private life. Right? So you have very few LGBT people that are at the top of business. And the LGBT people that are at the top of business are somewhat likely to have been very discreet about their sexual orientation until then. And and if you add to that the fact that there is an entire generation of gay men that died because of HIV, right, that should have been at the top of business, you find yourself with a network gap. And it is a network game, right? Meaning, if you don't have people that know you that are going to tap you into that world, you're less likely to join it. And then the last aspect, which I would not really talk about publicly, you know, because I think it's much more controversial, is that there remains a huge amount of prejudice. And, you know, it's not really expressed in, oh, I don't want, you know, a lesbian or a gay man on my board. It's much more expressed as, oh, they are not a very good cultural fit, or they don't have that one qualification we were looking at. And, you know, I love to tell people that if you're gay, if you're a lesbian, you have broken social norms. And so the board will be slightly suspicious of you, right? Can you be trusted? Are you a trustworthy person that can be entrusted with fiduciary responsibility if you have broken social norms, right? And so when you add all of those different components, that explains why LGBTQ plus people are underrepresented on the board, but also, frankly, why boards have a responsibility to make an extra effort to bring in those people and identify them and you know bring them in. It's a tall order in the US. I'm much more hopeful about France as an example, or Canada, but yeah, that's pretty much the reasons I have identified.
Thanks very much. Point taken about being in the places where you can be tapped on the shoulder. I think we've all experienced that not a good fit type of scenario. Mitzi, I want to tap into your extensive government experience here for a minute. And just from a policy perspective, what do you think are some of the most effective strategies for promoting diversity and inclusion in leadership roles?
Thank you so much. And, you know, one of the things that calls to mind from my political days and, you know, when I was a cabinet minister, or just, you know, being a representative on behalf of my local community, I recognize the responsibility to be that voice for those who were not at the table and to ask the questions. I remember distinctly as the education minister in Ontario, you know, we had a very stellar milestone achieved of, you know, 86.5% graduation rate, which is wonderful, and my team was celebrating. But I stepped back and I asked the question, who's in the 13.5, and can you tell me who's not graduating? And you know, everyone sort of stopped and said, oh, okay, and they provided me the data. And it turned out that it was Black students, it was Indigenous students, 2S LGBTQIA plus students in the care of our foster care or children's aid, students with disabilities. And, you know, I said to them, there's nothing inherently wrong with students in these groups or categories. It's the system that has to change to support them. And then we quickly developed policies, an education equity action plan. We embedded a secretariat within the ministry to oversee its implementation and to ensure to work across boards in our province to address and to correct these circumstances. You know, and I can give you many different examples where just being in that privileged place of being elected, you get to see things from a different lens and to challenge systems and policymakers to think more broadly and to think more inclusively. You know, in my local community, the local transit authority was replacing a shelter for train users. It was a train station. And, you know, what I noticed having grown up in that community was that shelter was just, you know, a little hut. And so I asked the question, because I knew the policy for design excellence was embedded in the transit authority. I said, is there a reason why my community is not getting this, you know, this privilege of having a design excellence bus shelter? And you know, what ended up happening was that it was put in place. And you go there today, it has an elevator. It's, people with accessibility needs are very well cared for. It's got a green roof. It's won many awards. And I think about it because it was simply a question that I asked. So what I would encourage those who are at tables that sometimes have these blind spots where they're not thinking about, they're not asking the gender question, they're not asking that question of inclusion, that use voice and really ask those questions, and so challenge those systems and those policymakers, because oftentimes they don't have the full view. Also, I know that this is not the same in the United States as much as it is in Canada, but in Canada, we do not have agreement across data sets in terms of disaggregated data. And I believe that also is a gap in our policy areas. We need data that breaks down by communities, by individuals, by backgrounds, how policies are affecting them. And we see that in health information. It is starting to improve slowly because during the pandemic, we lacked this data, and we noticed that people in certain groups were having higher risk and higher exposure than in other groups. But across the board, I think that having disaggregated data would help to improve our policymaking and really identify where resources need to be deployed more efficiently and effectively to address concerns by particular groups. Because sometimes it's not a lack of having the resources, it's that the resources are not reaching where the need is the greatest.
Great. I anticipate Lee will come back to you on the data, maybe in the round of questions. Lee, I want to come back to you and talk, in some of your publications, you've specifically talked about the role of mentorship. And that's a very important aspect of the 50-30 challenge. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the importance of mentorship at various levels in terms of building inclusive cultures.
Yeah, so I will say, mentorship is an extremely important tool that we have to try to make our universities, our workplaces, our organizations, to make them more diverse. And I have mostly, thought about mentoring from the perspective of, being a professor, being someone trying to have a more diverse pool of economists out there, because I think that's the key to getting better data, just to sort of to tie to that. In academia, we have come to have an acknowledgement of something that we call the hidden curriculum. We tell you what we're trying to teach you, economics or whatever, but inside that, there are all these unspoken things that we're hoping that you will learn that are very implicit. Values, expectations of people, norms within a, particular culture, if we're thinking very broadly, or within a particular profession. We have that in companies as well. I mean, those are some of the things that Mitzi and Fabrice were talking about. But we're not always conscious of those things. And I think if we are, I will say we as an LGBTI person, that if we're not conscious of it, we're making our lives harder if we're already breaking some of those social norms just because of, the strictness of gender and sexuality norms in our countries. So making that more explicit, how do you do that? Where you can't necessarily teach that in a class like you can, supply and demand curves, but you can provide that more privately in mentoring situations. I think that's really what we have to pass along to people who we are mentoring. If we are mentors, those are the things we should be asking about if we are the mentees. Can you make that more explicit? So mentoring is really kind of the one way that we have of doing that. And I think it's important, both to have mentors who maybe match our identities, and sometimes that can get complicated when it comes to intersectionality. Like how do we find that perfect match? But really, we can also learn a lot from people who don't share our identities. And so we really want both of those things. So I'll say that, one of the things that we've learned about mentoring in academia that's changed how we do that is we might have a pod of mentors. We have, a group of people who are being mentored by several more senior people. So so everybody kind of hears the same thing and gets different perspectives on this because, you know, we all come from, you know, different kinds of positions there. It's also possible to use mentoring in a different kind of way. You know, we think of this as a hierarchical relationship, the more senior person, the more junior person. But really, we learn from each other with people who are our peers, and we call that mutual mentoring. And sometimes being really explicit about that can be a very valuable way to do that. I retired from academia a year ago to start CAPA with Fabrice and some other colleagues. But even up until that point, I was still meeting with a group of other senior women economists, or not economists, actually, women faculty members, professors at my university, and still learning about how things really work. So there's always more to be learned. And I think having a mentoring program in place and companies that kind of recognize these subtleties, I think will probably be more successful in getting people the information that they need. So if they want to be a director someday, they kind of know how that really works. What's going to be expected of me? What are you going to be looking at? So I think these things all fit together very nicely.
Amazing. Thank you. All right, we're at the end of round 2 now. Wondering if you have any questions of each other or any comments.
Well, you know, I would love to ask Midzi whether she has any thoughts on quotas, right? Whether it's in politics actually or in business, right? I mean, as an example, you know, in France, you have quotas in politics, you have quotas in business that require woman representation, you know, in electoral list and on a board. And the United States had quotas, right? And it's definitely going the other direction. I would be very interested to hear what Midzi thinks about it.
Over to you, Mitzi.
I would say that I mean, it's not a straight yes or no, because it depends on the circumstance and the situation. If it's political parties who are fielding candidates that will represent populations, I absolutely believe that they should be aspiring to a gender equality in terms of candidates that are placed in winnable ridings. I think it's very important that we have that mix and that representation. In our provincial parliament here in Ontario, I think we're just around 34% women. And I know that the Prime Minister, you know, was committed to a gender equal cabinet in terms of the executive team, and seemed to have held to that throughout his time. So I think that the quotas do have their place. At the same time, if it's in a business context or in other situations and circumstances, it may be more difficult to achieve that. And so we have to be practical. I think what's important is to have an environment where you're noticing that that you need to have a much more inclusive and diverse culture, and creating a space for that. What I also want to say, because I've served on a lot of boards as well, and have been in many circumstances where, you know, I'm far less than a third or 50%, sometimes the only one, with my particular background, gender, intersectionality. And what is important as well is that leaders create safe environments for individuals who are, you know, joining a group to speak and to offer their thoughts and their ideas, and to receive that support, so that their contributions can be fully realized. And I think that regardless of the number, I think efforts have to be made to create that inclusion, that sense of belonging, once someone does join a group.
Amazing, thank you. Lee, do you want to chime in on the disaggregated data? I wanted to kind of pick up on that comment from Mitzi.
Yes, I love the fact that you raised that, Mitzi. It's so important because you can't really know if there's a problem with that data. You can't know if people are being treated equally without data. on outcomes. There's all sorts of reasons why we need it, and we know that those things matter a lot. To look within a layer of identities or marginalization. I think there are lots of challenges with regard to that. Apparently, I'm not really sure exactly why, because there are many questions that we have on our surveys, our national surveys, in the US and Canada, everywhere. And so there is the possibility for getting those kinds of details. There can be challenges around sample sizes. I will just say that's kind of the nerdy barrier, but there are ways around that. For small populations, if you're looking like LGBTI people and you want to look for a relatively small group within there, for example, poverty, that's very challenging sometimes to get very accurate measurements, but we can certainly do better than we're doing now. So a lot of it is about the willingness of the people who analyze the data. So there's getting the data, but then you got to get the knowledge out of it by doing the analysis. And I think sometimes that's the hardest step. But there are organizations that are working on this globally. Open Data Watch has a coalition of groups that are interested in intersectional data. COPPA, our organization, is part of that. So I think there's a lot of thought going into that now.
Excellent. Any further questions before we move on to round 3? All right, let's go.
I just wanted to say,
Oh, sure, go ahead.
I'm going to probably follow up with Lee to talk about the pod mentoring and the mutual mentors. I'm very passionate about mentoring, and I just hadn't heard those terms before. So thank you for sharing that. I thought they were really cool concepts, and also because we're getting into a much more virtual space oftentimes in workplaces. So mentoring is not the same as certainly when I started my career.
Great. Connections being made already. Okay, we'll move on to round 3 because we started a little bit late, and that'll give us some time to have some interaction with some of I think at one point we were up to 89 participants, so that's amazing. OK, back to Fabrice. J'aimerais poser une question en français. Vous fournissez de l'assistance technique à de nombreuses entreprises. Quelles sont les mesures pratiques que les organisations peuvent prendre pour mettre en œuvre ce type de stratégie?
Alors, je dirais qu'il y a une différence quand même assez énorme entre les entreprises européennes et les entreprises dans l'Amérique du Nord. C'est-à-dire que, comme Lille le mentionne souvent, un indicateur de succès, c'est pouvoir capturer les données raciales et les données sur la base du genre et sur la base d'autres caractéristiques telles que l'orientation sexuelle ou l'identité de genre. Le problème, c'est qu'en Europe, c'est très difficile de contourner des lois qui protègent les individus en s'assurant qu'on ne puisse pas prendre de données sur les caractéristiques d'orientation sexuelle, d'identité de genre ou même de race. Et ça, parfois, c'est un peu une difficulté. Pour moi, avoir des données, c'est souvent la base de départ. Et j'ai un peu remarqué ça, par exemple, dans mon travail sur la diversité des boards, c'est que euh, souvent, quand on ne peut pas mettre un chiffre sur le problème, il y a beaucoup moins de volonté d'adresser le problème. Et parfois même, les gens vous diront, ben, je ne vois pas quel est le problème. Si les femmes veulent rentrer sur le conseil d'administration des entreprises, elles n'ont qu'à travailler dur. Et donc, pour pouvoir répondre à ça, souvent, il faut avoir des données. Donc je pense qu'une des difficultés pour les entreprises, c'est arriver à comprendre l'amplitude du problème lorsqu'elles n'ont peut-être pas l'opportunité de collecter des données. L'autre chose sur laquelle, pour moi, qui est extrêmement important, c'est cette idée des groupes d'employés par affinité. Alors, en anglais, on dit Employee Resource Group. parfois, c'est un peu contraire à la culture, par exemple, de l'Europe. Et il y a cette idée de pourquoi vous êtes obligé de vous séparer, d'avoir votre propre groupe. Pour moi, c'est extrêmement important et j'aime beaucoup dire que l'expérience des personnes LGBT et qu'elles amènent avec eux cette expérience de honte. C'est-à-dire que très souvent, même aujourd'hui, elles ont cette expérience d'avoir honte de qui elles sont. Et l'antidote contre ça, dans l'entreprise, c'est pouvoir être fier de qui on est, être fier de ses origines, être fier de son identité, et avoir un groupe qui vous appuie et qui célèbre des moments spécifiques, tels que la journée mondiale contre l'homophobie et la transphobie, ou le mois des fiertés. Ça permet aux minorités de, 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 de contrarier un petit peu ce sentiment de honte qu'elles amènent avec elles. Et, euh, et ça, parfois, c'est un peu difficile à expliquer aux entreprises. C'est-à-dire que, par exemple, en France, j'ai déjà entendu une rhétorique qui dit: Ah, on a les syndicats et donc on n'a pas besoin de groupes spécifiques pour les employés de couleur, ou on n'a pas besoin de groupes spécifiques pour les employés homosexuels. Et souvent expliquer le fait que les employés vont avoir besoin d'avoir un endroit où ils peuvent se réunir, où ils peuvent se sentir appuyés. Ça fait partie de l'antidote à la honte qui vient avec, par exemple, l'expérience d'être homosexuel dans notre société. Et enfin, la dernière chose sur laquelle, pour moi, je travaille énormément quand j'ai l'occasion de travailler avec une entreprise sur cette question, c'est essayer de convaincre le CEO de l'entreprise et parfois l'actionnariat, parfois le conseil d'administration, que ça fait partie d'un agenda de développement durable. C'est-à-dire cette idée qu'aujourd'hui, quand on est une entreprise, on ne peut pas se permettre d'ignorer les questions d'inclusion dans le monde du travail. Et qu'à terme, c'est vrai que peut-être dans le court terme, on peut réussir à générer du profit et à être une entreprise qui est performante sans avoir cette diversité, mais dans le long terme, il y a des risques énormes. Et souvent, ça passe par essayer d'amener toutes les informations dont on a discuté aujourd'hui, qui sont le business case, qui sont les questions démographiques, qui sont les données sur l'expérience des employés dans l'entreprise, pour convaincre le chef de l'entreprise: vous allez gagner à travailler sur ces sujets. Donc pour moi, c'est un peu ces trois éléments qui sont extrêmement importants. Euh, euh, faire convaincre les entreprises qu'un employee resource group, ça peut changer les choses énormément. Convaincre la direction de l'entreprise que c'est une question de performance, que c'est une question de stratégie dans le long terme, et essayer, quand c'est possible, que les entreprises collectent des données sur l'expérience de leurs employés et les efforts d'inclusion qu'elles font.
Merci, and thank you for talking about the importance of those employee resource groups. I just did a workshop a couple of weeks ago in Ontario with the Children's Aid Society, and they were talking about the revival of their LGBTIQ employee resource group and how important that was in terms of both supporting each other, but also being advocates to management as they were about to embark on a new DEI strategy. So very much appreciated. Lee, I'm going to move over to you, but first I'm going to throw some statistics at you from a recent Working for Change project that Egale was involved in. The goal of that project was to capture a more kind of extensive understanding of the employment landscape for two-spirit, trans, and non-binary people in Canada. And maybe not shockingly, but it found out that 72% of survey participants had experienced workplace discrimination, and 49% of survey participants had quit their job at some point due to not feeling accepted in the workplace. And I want to, as we're talking about disaggregated data, specifically focus on some of the anti-trans backlash that we're seeing in this particular moment. And how do you think we stay true to the ideals of 50-30, given this kind of immense kind of anti-gender movements, anti-trans ideology that's emerging and kind of enveloping both of our countries?
That's a great question. And it's actually, it's complicated because it's even bigger than that, I think. I think that the businesses have to stay true to the kinds of things that we've been talking about this morning, about the business case, about the missions of businesses as organizations and the context that they are working in. And I think that's about not just, trying to understand actual illegal discrimination, because it is illegal, but to understand how you can prevent that from happening, and build that into policies and practices. And I think the LGBTI movement learned a lot over the last couple of years in the United States about how much more work we have to do, actually, on thinking about the experiences of trans and non-binary people in the workplace. And I think businesses kind of ignore that at their peril. I think kind of going back to basics is really important. We spent a lot of time talking to each other early in the days of, making LGB people more visible, helping business leaders understand their experiences, talking to other workers in the workplace. Having leaders make it clear that the values of a particular organization do include everyone. And so it was a big conversation that I think, we have to be more attentive to. But I think, again, bringing it back to, I don't know, I call them the three F's. First of all, there's fact and fantasy. What's really happening with trans and non-binary people in the workplace, with all the different groups that are now, considered by some in the US to be under the DEIA umbrella. They've made it a very wide umbrella. It covers almost everybody. There aren't a lot of people that it leaves out. But in thinking about that, again, coming back to the mission of the business, and remembering the business case. The business case is so important. And let me throw a couple more stats out at everybody else, because I think we've talked about customers and young people and employees and how those groups are all becoming much more diverse. But the extent of that is really important to understand. In the United States, the Gallup poll has been tracing over the last 15 years or so the percentage of people who report being LGBT. And that has, gone up a little bit, 3 to 5 to 6, maybe 7%. But if you break it down by generation, here's what it looks like. People in my generation and those of us, and we're probably not all the same generation, but those of us on the panel, it stayed pretty low, pretty steady. If you look at the millennials, it's going up. And about 1 in 10 millennials identify as LGBT. If you look at Gen Z, the youngest ones, 1 in 5 identify as LGBT or as kind of non-heterosexual and non-cisgender in some way. In Canada, it's not quite, from what I can tell, the data that I found is not quite as stark, but still 1 in 10 young people from 15 to 24 identify as LGBT. 1% identify as trans or non-binary. So those numbers are getting bigger. And if businesses want to be attentive to their customers, they want to be attentive to the people who want to work there, they have to actually be ready to hire those folks. And I think that's going to mean that you have to keep your eye on what their experience is in the workplace, first and foremost. You've got to keep your eye on how you're doing recruiting to make sure you're getting those folks in, because it's not just that they're trans and non-binary. It's because they're creative, well-trained people that you need in your workforce. So I think if you kind of keep it that way, and sort of, the fact and fantasy line is pretty clear with regard, I think, to those demographics. It's quite clear in the context of what that means for other people. It doesn't mean that you're discriminating against people who are not trans. What we see, in all kinds of discrimination, we see evidence of discrimination against women, experience of discrimination against people of color, discrimination against LGBTI people. over and over and over again. So how do we, kind of deal with that disjuncture between who's seeing the facts, who's seeing the fantasy about what's happening? That's the third F, it's framing. And I think, again, the effective framing in a moment like this is one about going back to your core mission, which everybody has always kind of bought into. What are businesses there for? They're there to make money, and they are going to do better at that if they are more inclusive and more diverse. So I don't know. I think we're at a moment where we're going to be playing around with the framing and trying to understand, what does fit, that makes sense to people about what corporations are doing, what employers are doing, not just corporations, universities. So it's going to take some time to better understand that, but I think, kind of going back to that has been the thing that has kept businesses in support of things like affirmative action in the 1980s when Ronald Reagan wanted to get rid of it. It's gotten them on board with LGBTI inclusion, and it's still a really important tool, and they keep talking about it, and I think that's that's a frame that we can at least keep pushing on.
Great, thanks for those very practical Fs for as guidance for all of us. Mitzi, you get the final word on the rounds of questions. And I think because the Women's Foundation is a challenge participant, we sort of look to you. What sort of general advice would you give to the multiple small and medium-sized organizations that are joining the call today that have been challenge participants about implementing 50/30 as it sort of wraps down in this quarter?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think just the fact that you've signed up and have access to these great resources that Egale has put out, and also a network is really, you're ahead of a lot of other companies and organizations. I think that it is really important to take a look at your internal policies, your HR policies, your people and culture, and even celebrating days and months is good, but really talk to those individuals who have identified, and listen to them, have a conversation around their experiences in the workplace. I think that's going to be very enlightening for organizations and for leaders. I've been a small business owner myself. I had a startup very early in my career, and I know that it's an overwhelming time because you're essentially trying to just keep everything going and keep the engines going. But I know for sure that your team and the talents and the skills that they bring are really very important to the success of your organization, and caring for that talent and retaining them is see that as a cost to business. I also want to touch on areas that are not traditionally seen as inclusive, and those workplaces, for instance, the skilled trades area, for instance, there are many small businesses that are sub-trades. You're facing a talent shortage, right? Like, you're not able to recruit or to succession, find the next generation, and so being faced with change is I think a good thing, because it's at a time when you can bring in diverse individuals and recognize that the workplace culture itself has to shift, so that those workplaces don't become what is known as the leaky pipeline, where you're able to bring people in but you can't keep them because they don't want to be in a culture that makes them feel unsafe or not welcomed. So that's something that should be paid attention to. but you know, don't give up. Like I think the fact that you're here and you're listening, you're getting good tips and ideas, you know, don't like try those different techniques and create environments where people truly feel as if they belong. At the Canadian Women's Foundation, we're Canada's public foundation for gender equality and justice, and you know, we have a program for feminist entrepreneurs, as I mentioned. And I want to give an example of one of those companies, Edda's Bakery in Winnipeg, because it's a social enterprise. It's creating entrepreneurship and career opportunities for queer and for trans as well as for people of color. And it's a co-op based model. It helps build those business skills, but also, you know, provides empowerment and training for young people, giving them new skills and in jobs and in business experience. And this has become a community hub. This has become a place for the community to gather, and of course, it's a self-sufficient social enterprise model. So ideas and innovation and creativity come from a more diverse and inclusive workplace culture. So I know that that's something that small businesses are seeking, and so, you know, really continue to be open-minded, and remember that it's really about being human at the end of the day, expressing that openness, that empathy, that understanding. The truth in the matter is that, you know, when you think about maybe what is happening around the world, and it becomes like an overwhelming thing, but if we put on our human hat and our human lens, and treat people with dignity and the way that we want to be treated, then it makes those places safer for everyone.
Amazing. Thank you. And we do now have some questions that have come in through the Q&A or the chat feature, either one. So if any of our participants who've stayed with us past the hour want to put in questions, please do. But I'll read out this one and perhaps ask all three of our panelists to comment, because I think it's sort of ties into some of what we've discussed today about this particular moment we're in. So the question is, how do we best protect and entrench equitable and inclusive policies in this moment of time with the rollback and retreat of EDI policies? Should we think about shifting our framing and using human rights-based language, which can be better tied to legal obligations and protections, or should we be defending the existing EDI frameworks, which seem to be under attack? Fabrice.
Yeah, you know, that's interesting because this morning I was reading an article in Out magazine, and there was a guy from West Hollywood in California that penned an article, and he said we should change our name from LGBTQ plus to Queer Americans. And he, you know, the entire article is explaining why he thinks, you know, that this is a good strategy and that it will prevent backlash. And you know, my natural instinct is, and I have the same belief about DEI. You don't change the semantics, you know what I mean? Like you know, you can make any contortion possible to try to avoid this this backlash. You know, I don't think that's what is going to make things better. What makes things better is for companies to know what their values are and to stick to it and communicate them in a clear way, right? And I agree with the idea that you know, framing it as exclusively an economic interest is probably not the best. I prefer, you know, to put in parallel the human rights argument and the economic argument. You know, I love the way Midzi ended a remark, right? Which is it's about dignity and about our common humanity, right? And very often, you know, when you take the time to listen to the experience of minorities and underrepresented group, you develop that empathy in thinking, okay, well, we should do something, right? But I would say, you know, to me, it's not so much about semantics. It's not so much about changing what we are seeing. is for companies to look inside and be like, what are my values, and how can I go through this temporary situation and stay the course, right? To me, that's the most important. I would warn again changing, semantics and discourse to try to adapt to the moment.
Mitzi?
Yeah, it's hard to answer this question because the moment changes day by day. And that's why I included those laws and those values. I certainly know that in Canada, because democracy is fragile, and it's also shaped by participation and action. And I think that I'm watching those individual firms and organizations as well, in terms of how they respond, how they treat people, and because it's I feel as if this moment will pass, but it's going to be a few years before it does. And so I think that people need to I think lean into democracy right now, and be very clear about the things that they value, and like justice and the rule of law, and because some of those things are being challenged right now, fairness, and all the things you learn in kindergarten really start to apply right now. So I would be on the side of doing it in smart ways, but reminding people of what's at stake in the broader context.
Lee, did you want to weigh in on that one?
Yeah, I don't want to come across as sounding too economistic about things. I do think values are important, but I guess I'm thinking that, a direction to at least consider in terms of framing is going at what those core values are without calling it DEIA necessarily. But it depends. It depends on what your position is, right? But really, in my mind, and this is a little bit towards the next question that's up there, is I think it's important for employers to say, we don't discriminate, or we try really hard not to discriminate, because it's the law, it's the right thing to do. That in some ways is kind of the core issue. And again, I think what that speaks to is that there is a sense of a group of people out there. And I don't think they fit, like it's not an identity-based box. It's much more complicated than that. But there is a group of people out there that feels like they have not been treated fairly. And I think to talk more clearly about how businesses do what they do to hire workers, and how they treat everybody the same way, or try to, in the context of their employment and their pay and that sort of thing, might help in this kind of situation. I don't know that that's I don't know that that's, going to be the total answer. But when people ask me, what's going to happen, what are all these companies saying? And we don't really know. They're saying they're not going to answer surveys. They're saying they're not going to do this. Maybe this other little thing they're not going to do. But really, what they need to do is to stand up and say, we're not going to discriminate against anybody. And so, that's another, kind of foundational piece of it. That's both a value and a business need to not discriminate.
Thanks. So there's two more questions, and we've just got about a few minutes left. So I'm going to try to combine them. I think there's one question about sort of, given that it's 2025 and, we've seen policy and legislative changes happen in Canada. Why in particular are there still these gaps for 2S LGBTQI people in the workplace? And then to add on to that, just to kind of combine that with the next question, which is to particularly talk about how governments and private sector can work together to address tech facilitated violence and discrimination. which tend to be targeted primarily at women and members of the 2S LGBTQI community. So maybe to combine your answers to that so that we can wrap up on time today, and I can thank the people I need to thank. Who wants to tackle those first? Fabrice?
On tech, very quickly, I will say on tech, when I was at the United Nations, I had a boss, Kate Gilmore. She used to say, with the privilege of making profit comes great responsibility. Right now, a lot of company wants us to believe that they don't owe anything to anybody. They just roll out their product and may the ship fall, whatever happens, happens. That's not the case. I mean, if you create a technology that is having a negative impact on people, you have a responsibility to ensure that you take some steps. And I think, it's not only for the tech industry, it's a lot of the private sector is saying, I don't owe anything to anybody. I'm just here to make money. Of course, that doesn't work. It's a crazy narrative. And I hope, I hope that the regulator and governments at some point are going to stand back and say, no, you created that tool. You have to to ensure that it's not having a negative impact on people. To me, that's obvious.
Well, we're doing a lot of work on this at the Canadian Women's Foundation. So please visit canadianwomen.org, because we will be releasing quite a few resources and tools to fight this. This is something that I feel that is it's really important, because if we think that discrimination and unfairness happens in the workplace and in the real world, just take a look at the online space. It is unsafe for women, for gender diverse people, to us LGBTQIA+, and for a lot of racialized people. Think of a Muslim woman, for instance, and the risk here is that self-censorship, right, where people just don't go on those spaces because they feel unsafe, but that limits their economic opportunity and all of the things that are happening in the world as a result of technology. So I do agree with Fabrice that there's a responsibility for those tech companies to create policies and to design platforms that are safe for everyone. Governments need to provide the corridors and make sure that there's proper oversight. In Canada, we had Bill C-63 that unfortunately, because of prorogation, has died on the Parliament, but hopefully that will be revived by successive governments, because it is imperative that we keep people safe, children especially online, and there are a lot of harms that are happening because of these gaps. I also want to say that that's one of the reasons why innovation and investment needs to happen. We're looking at the part of women and gender diverse people, because when it comes to VC capital, only about 4% goes into women-owned and led businesses and startups, and that's that we need to see more diverse people actually becoming the owners of these tech algorithms, so that we create safe platforms for everyone.
Lee, final word.
Yeah, I would just add that in economics, there are different schools. The most, market-oriented school that says, free markets will create the most value for consumers and for employers and that sort of thing. But there are still boundaries that we recognize that does not happen if you go outside certain boundaries. And one of those boundaries is what we call externalities. When you come to a platform to, see what your, high school classmates are up to and to share photos, and what you get is a lot of abuse, you are getting something that you didn't bargain for, that you didn't pay for, right? You're still paying with your data that they're making a lot of money off of. And that's a fundamental market failure. That is a fundamental market failure. And I think starting to see it that way might help with getting beyond, some of the other kinds of concerns that people have about, whether or not this is an appropriate use of pressure of government policy to try to stop it. So that's what I would offer as a suggestion for a frame.
Can I just give an example of what you're saying, Lee, quickly, Kim? Because, you know, when the pandemic happened and we were all forced online and we all started using this Zoom platform. And I remember, you know, I was elected at the time and I had to join, you know, different committees and I would disappear. And I was wondering what's going on with this platform. And, you know, what came out was that the algorithm, when it was put together, didn't think about skin tone. You know, they quickly corrected it. I'm not saying it's a problem today, but it is in the design as well. Like we have to think about inclusivity and the broadest possible impact in the design and think about who is not represented at your table when you're creating.
That's a great final word, Mitzi, and I really appreciate the kind of always look to the smaller number and sort of figure out what that represents rather than just look at sort of maybe big numbers and success. I'm going to bring us to a close now, and I just want to do a few thank yous before everyone goes off on their day feeling inspired and invigorated to tackle these challenges. First of all, I want to thank our amazing guest panelists today, Mitzi, Lee, and Fabrice. It was an amazing conversation and one that I hope continues in various types of platforms to be determined. I also want to thank our the amazing numbers of participants that we had on the call with us today and the questions that they posed to us. The 50-30 challenge has been quite successful in terms of the numbers of participants, and we see that reflected today in this panel. I want to thank the Government of Canada for funding this